The Revelation Explained by F.G. Smith, Chapter 11, Part 3. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian and soldier, born in 330 A.D., lived during these times, and adverting to this subject says, quote, "It was no wonder to see those who were ambitious of human greatness contending with so much heat and animosity for that dignity, because when they had obtained it, they were sure to be enriched by the offerings of the matrons, and of appearing abroad in great splendor, of being admired for their costly coaches and sumptuous feasts, outdoing sovereign princes in the expenses of their table." End quote. This led Proexticatus, a heathen, who was prefect of the city, to say, quote, "Make me a bishop of Rome, and I'll be a Christian too." End quote. Speaking of the period now under consideration, Eusebius, the father of church history, mentions one Paul, who was at this time bishop of Antioch, who lived in luxury and licentiousness, and who was a teacher of erroneous doctrines, and usurped so great authority that the people feared to venture to accuse him. In the conclusion of the same chapter in which this is found, he shows that after a general council was held at Antioch, this Paul was excommunicated and robbed of his bishopric by the bishops of Rome and Italy. From this it appears that they possessed an authority still greater than that usurped by Paul. The following are his words, quote, "Paul, therefore, having thus fallen from the episcopate, together with the true faith as already said, Domnus succeeded in administration of the church at Antioch. But Paul, being unwilling to leave the building of the church, an appeal was made to the Emperor Aurelian, who decided most equitably on the business, ordering the building to be given up to those whom the Christian bishops of Italy and Rome should write." End quote. From Ecclesiastical History, Book 7, Chapter 30. The Encyclopedia Britannica says that this council at which Paul was excommunicated was held, quote, "probably in the year 268, end quote, and that, quote, Paul continued in his office until the year 272, when the city was taken by the Emperor Aurelian, who decided in person that the church building belonged to the bishop who was in epistolary communication with the bishops of Rome and Italy." End quote. From Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 18, page 429. And this is the 1918. Oh, I think I messed up there. That quote was from, yes, that was correct, the Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm sorry. The above extracts show not only the development of error in the church, but also the great power already obtained by the hierarchy. Geo. Fisher says, quote, "The accession of Constantine, AD 312, found the church so firmly organized under the hierarchy that it could not lose its identity by being absolutely merged in the state." End quote. From History of the Christian Church, page 99. That was compiled or written by George Park Fisher. In the year AD 270, Anthony, an Egyptian, the founder of the monastic institution, fixed his abode in the deserts of Egypt and formed monks into organized bodies. Quote, influenced by these eminent examples, Anthony, Hilarion, etc., immense multitudes betook themselves to the desert, and innumerable monasteries were fixed in Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and Serbia. Some of the Egyptian abbots are spoken of as having had 5, 7, or even 10,000 monks under their personal direction. And the Thebais, as well as certain spots in Arabia, are reported to have been literally crowded with solitaries. Nearly 100,000 of all classes, it is said, were at one time to be found in Egypt, although the enthusiasm might be at a lower ebb in one country than in another. It actually affected the Church Universal, so far as the extant materials of ecclesiastical history enables us to trace its rise and progress. The more rigid and heroic of the Christian anchorets dispensed with all clothing except a rug or a few palm leaves around the loins. Most of them abstained from the use of water for ablution, which means the act of washing oneself. Nor did they usually wash or change the garments they had once put on. Thus, Saint Anthony, the founder of this order, bequeathed to Athanasius a skin in which his sacred person had been wrapped for half a century. They also allowed their beards and nails to grow, and sometimes became so hirsute, which is a word meaning hairy, shaggy, or bushy, as to be actually mistaken for hyenas or bears. End quote. From History of Romanism, page 88 and 89. Reader, what was the condition of the so-called church in AD 270 that could make the introduction of such abominations possible? Although many more historical quotations on this point might be added, I will conclude with the 2 following extracts from Joseph Milner's History of the Church of Christ. Quote, we shall, for the present, leave Anthony propagating the monastic dispositions and extending its influence not only into the next century, but for many ages after, and conclude this view of the state of the 3rd century with expressing our regret that the faith and love of the gospel received toward the close of it a dreadful blow from the encouragement of this unchristian practice. End quote. From Century 3, Chapter 20. Quote, moral and philosophical and monastic instructions will not effect for men what is to be expected from evangelical doctrine. And if the faith of Christ was so much declined, and its decayed state ought to be dated from about the year 270, we need not wonder that such scenes as Eusebius hints at with any circumstantial details took place in the Christian world. Century 4, Chapter 1. After reading the foregoing statements of historians, the reader will, I believe, agree with me that the year 270 is a consistent date, to mark the time when the visible external church was wholly given over to the profane multitude of uncircumcised, idolatrous Gentiles to tread underfoot. Measuring forward the allotted period of 1260 years brings us to the exact date of the first Protestant creed, the Augsburg Confession, in AD 1530. We must point to this date both for the end of Rome's universal spiritual supremacy and for the rise of Protestantism. D.L. Byng, in his History of the Reformation, when he comes to this period, says, quote, "The conflicts hitherto described have been only partial. We are entering upon a new period, that of general battles. Spires, 1529, and Augsburg, 1530, are names that shine forth with more immortal glory than Marathon, Pavia, and Marengo. Forces that up to the present time were separate are now uniting into one energetic band." Book 18, Chapter 1, from History of the Reformation by D.L. Byng. Quote, "The first two books of this volume contain the most important epochs of the Reformation, the Protests of Spires and the Confession of Augsburg. I determined on bringing the Reformation of Germany and German Switzerland to the decisive epochs of 1530 and 1531. The history of the Reformation, properly so called, is then, in my opinion, almost complete in those countries. The work of faith has there attained its apogee, that in conferences of interims of diplomacy begins. The movement of the 16th century has there made its effort. I said from the first, it is the history of the Reformation, and not of Protestantism, that I am relating." End quote. From D.L. Byng, Preface to Volume 5. This ends Part 3 of Chapter 11.